Hi guys, tonight we step out onto the open prairie and the cold hits you immediately sharp and honest, the kind of cold that does not care how brave you feel. You stand there in present tense boots sinking slightly into frozen soil wind scraping across your face like it has a personal grudge. The land stretches flat and bare in every direction and there is nowhere to hide. No trees, no hills, no friendly shadow to break the blast. Just you, the sky, and a temperature that drops fast once the sun gives up for the day. You probably will not survive this, not without changing how you think about shelter entirely. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are here, tell me where you're listening from and what the local time is. Now dim the lights and let yourself imagine that this is not a story, but a night you are about to live through. You look down at the ground because the ground is the only thing offering you mercy. Above it, the wind owns everything. Below it, there is at least the promise of stillness. Out here on the 19th century, American plains people quickly learned a simple rule. If you cannot beat the cold, you hide from it. And hiding often means digging. The idea of a dugout home sounds primitive to modern ears, like a temporary mistake on the way to something better. But when the first brutal winter arrives, when canvas tents snap like paper and wooden shacks bleed, heat faster than a body can replace it, the earth starts to look like an ally. You kneel and press a bare hand to the soil, feeling how it holds onto a muted, steady chill rather than the screaming cold of the air. There is a mainstream historical fact that shows up again and again in settler diaries. Ground temperature just a few feet below the surface stays far more stable than the air above, even in winter. People did not know the science in modern terms, but they felt it. They trusted their hands and bones. That trust drove them to carve homes directly into hillsides or straight down into flat prairie, creating rooms that the wind could not steal from. As you imagine picking up a shovel, you feel the weight of the decision. Digging is exhausting, slow work. The soil is stubborn, sometimes frozen hard enough to ring when metal strikes it. Yet settlers kept digging because the alternative was worse. Frostbite did not announce itself politely. It crept in at night, numb fingers first, then toes, then deeper things. People learned fast that survival here was not about comfort. It was about reducing exposure, about creating a small pocket where the cold had to work harder to reach you. There is a quirky detail that often gets overlooked. Some dugouts were dug partially on purpose and partially by accident. Settlers would start with a shallow cut for a temporary shelter, then expand it season by season, as they realized how effective underground living could be. One winter pushed them deeper. Another winter widened the walls. Over time, what started as desperation slowly turned into design, even if no one would have used that word at the time. You scrape dirt away and imagine the smell rising up damp and mineral grounding in a way that oddly calms you. The sound of wind fades as the walls rise around you, replaced by the dull thud of shovel against earth. Historians still argue whether dugouts were primarily a planned architectural choice or a last resort born of panic and poverty. The truth likely sits uncomfortably in between. Some settlers embraced the idea early. Others resisted until cold forced their hand. As the hole deepens, you start to feel something shift. The cold does not vanish, but it changes character. It becomes quieter, less aggressive. The earth muffles sound too. Above ground, the prairie never stops talking. Wind howls, grass rasps, distant animals cry out. Down here those noises soften like someone turned the volume knob just enough for your shoulders to drop. You think about how strange it must have felt the first time someone realized this worked. That a hole in the ground could feel safer than the open sky. In a culture that often celebrated upward movement, building higher, claiming land with visible structures, the dugout was almost an act of humility. You literally lower yourself to survive. You accept that the land is stronger than you, and instead of fighting it, you tuck yourself inside it. The sun sinks fast now. Light thins and turns blue, then grey. You feel the urgency settlers felt. Dig before dark. Dig before the temperature drops another 10 degrees. Dig before your fingers stop listening to your brain. There are accounts of people finishing their first dugout by lantern-light hands, shaking breath, puffing white even inside the pit. They slept that first night half-buried, wrapped in whatever they had, trusting the earth to do the rest. You pause and look around your imagined shelter. The walls are rough, uneven, streaked with roots. Dirt clings to your clothes. It is not pretty. It is not comfortable. But it feels like something that might let you wake up in the morning. And that out here is the entire point. As you settle deeper into this space, you start to understand the mindset that made dugout homes possible. It is not about optimism. It is about practicality edged with quiet hope. Hope that the ground will not collapse. Hope that the roof you will add later will hold. Hope that the cold will respect this boundary at least a little. You hear the wind roar above you now, stronger as night claims the plains. But it sounds distant, frustrated, like it lost track of you. Down here, the earth presses in on all sides, heavy and constant, and for the first time since stepping onto this land, you feel something close to safety. The coldest nights of the Wild West are coming, but you've taken the first step toward surviving them. You're underground, listening, breathing, and letting the land do what it does best. Hold steady. You stay low because staying low makes sense now. When you lift your head and glance back toward the horizon, you see again what pushed people into the ground in the first place. The land is wide, almost offensively open. It does not offer timber the way eastern forests did, and it does not apologize for that fact. Trees appear as rumours rather than resources. A few twisted cottonwoods cling to creek beds miles away, but they are already claimed by distance and exhaustion. Out here you learn quickly that wishing for wood does not make it appear. The prairie teaches this lesson early and without mercy. Settlers arriving from wooded regions carried assumptions with them. Cabins, fences, fireplaces all depended on trees. The reality waiting for them was a grass ocean that rolled endlessly under the sky. Mainstream historical records from homesteading surveys confirm that vast stretches of the Great Plains had fewer than 1 tree per acre, sometimes none at all. That absence shaped everything, especially how people survived winter nights. You imagine walking for hours just to find enough branches for a small fire, only to realize you would burn through them in a single evening. The math never works in your favor. Even if you manage to build a wooden structure, it leaks heat like a sieve. Wind slips through gaps, rattles boards, and carries warmth away faster than a body can replenish it. People learned that wood was precious, not because it was warm, but because it was rare. So you return your attention to the ground because the ground is always there. It does not need to be hauled or chopped. It does not run out. You scrape your fingers along the wall of your dugout and feel the density of it, the way it resists temperature swings. Above ground, a winter night can swing from tolerable to deadly in hours. Down here, change happens slowly. That slowness becomes survival. There is a small but telling detail that shows up in personal letters. Some settlers describe their dugout homes as feeling like cellars rather than houses. That comparison mattered. Cellars were already known as places where food stayed cool in summer and did not freeze as quickly in winter. Translating that logic to human shelter was not a huge leap, but it was a humbling one. You stop thinking of your home as a symbol and start thinking of it as insulation. A quirky tidbit often overlooked is how people tested locations before committing. Some settlers dug shallow test pits and spent time inside them, sometimes even sleeping there briefly to judge warmth and moisture. Imagine lying in a hole in the ground, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind and deciding whether this patch of earth might keep you alive. It sounds absurd now, but it was a practical experiment at the time. The absence of trees also changes how sound behaves. Above ground, wind rushes unbroken, carrying every noise across miles. Down here, earth absorbs vibration. Your dugout feels quieter, not just warmer. That quiet has a psychological effect. Cold is easier to endure when it does not scream at you all night. The prairie does scream, especially in winter. The ground, by contrast, hums softly and consistently. You start to understand why dugouts spread so widely across certain regions. Kansas, Nebraska, parts of the Dakotas. These were not areas where people lacked skill or ambition. They lacked materials. Historians still debate whether dugouts should be seen as clever adaptations or symbols of environmental defeat. Some argue settlers bent intelligently to local conditions. Others suggest they were overwhelmed and forced underground. Both ideas can be true at the same time. As you settle further into your space, you notice how even your breathing feels different. The air is cooler but steadier, less whipped by gusts. Moisture clings to the walls, giving off a faint, earthy smell. It is not pleasant, but it is familiar, almost comforting. This is the smell of soil that has always been here long before fences or claims or maps. You think about how expectations shifted over that first winter. Many people arrived believing dugouts were temporary something to endure until a proper house could be built. Yet winter after winter, some stayed underground longer than planned. Not because they failed, but because the dugout worked. It kept them alive. It let them sleep. It didn't care about appearances. There is a quiet irony here. In trying to claim the land, settlers ended up letting the land claim them instead. They adapted their bodies and routines to its limits. The lack of trees stripped away options, forcing simplicity. Dig, cover, insulate, endure. These became nightly rituals rather than lofty goals. You imagine snow beginning to fall outside, muffling the prairie even further. Above ground, the wind sculpts drifts into sharp shapes. Down here, you feel only a subtle pressure change a heavier stillness. The earth takes on more of the burden. That is the unspoken bargain. You give up light space and comfort. In return, the ground gives you a fighting chance. As darkness deepens, you lie back and listen. The prairie continues its endless motion above you, but it feels far away now. The treeless land that once seemed hostile has revealed a different kind of generosity. It cannot offer you wood, but it offers you itself. And on the coldest nights of the Wild West, there was enough to keep people breathing until morning. You keep working because stopping makes the cold louder. Each movement sends a dull ache through your arms and back, but the rhythm matters more than comfort now. Scoop, lift, toss. The soil resists packed tight with roots and stubborn clods, and you begin to understand why people describe dugout building as both exhausting and strangely satisfying. Every inch removed is an inch. The wind cannot touch you later. Sweat gathers under your clothes even as the air bites at your face. It is an odd contradiction one settlers complained about often. You work hard enough to sweat, then freeze the moment you pause. This is where stubborn hope comes in. You do not dig because it feels good. You dig because stopping feels worse. There is a mainstream historical fact tucked into agricultural reports from the period. Homesteaders were required to improve their land to prove their claim, and building a shelter, even a dugout, counted. That legal pressure added urgency to physical survival. You carve walls directly out of sod-thick slabs of grass and earth cut like bricks and stacked, or left in place depending on the design. The smell intensifies green and loamy mixed with the iron tang of fresh soil. Your hands sting skin cracking despite gloves. People learned quickly to keep moving not just for progress but for warmth. Labour itself became a heating strategy. There is a quirky detail that surfaces in some diaries. A few settlers believed certain soil types were warmer than others, almost like the land had moods. They would argue over clay versus loam, over dark earth versus pale. While modern science might smile at the idea, those beliefs guided real decisions. People trusted what felt warmer to the touch, even if the difference was imagined. As the dugout takes shape, you begin to see it less as a hole and more as a room. Corners appear. A low shelf emerges from the wall where tools or a candle might rest. The ceiling is still open to the sky for now, but you already picture how it will be covered with poles, sod, and whatever else you can find. This mental shift matters. Survival depends not only on structure but on belief that the structure will hold. Historians still question how much planning went into early dugouts versus improvisation. Some evidence suggests settlers borrowed ideas from previous frontier experiences or even from military earthworks. Others argue most designs evolved on the fly, shaped by fatigue weather and available materials. Standing here shovel in hand, it feels like both. You plan just enough to keep going. Your breath fogs as daylight fades and the temperature drops with a speed that feels personal. You hurry knowing that an unfinished shelter is still better than none. People often slept in partially completed dugouts their first nights, wrapping themselves in blankets and trusting the earth walls to block the worst of the wind. That trust was not blind. It was tested hour by hour, shiver by shiver. You pause to stretch your back and listen. The prairie answers with a low, constant sound, wind sliding over grass like water. Down in the pit, that sound dulls, becomes background noise rather than threat. This is one of the first rewards of digging. Silence, or something close to it. Silence helps the body rest, and rest helps the body survive cold. There is another overlooked tidbit. Some settlers decorated their dugouts almost immediately. Scrap of cloth hung on a wall, a shelf smoothed with a knife. These small acts were not frivolous. They signalled intention to stay. In the face of endless cold nights, making a space feel human mattered more than aesthetics. You climb out briefly to survey your work, then drop back down, feeling the difference instantly. Even unfinished, the pit holds a pocket of calmer air. You imagine how much more noticeable this will be once the roof is on. The thought keeps you going. Hope here is practical, not poetic. It looks like thicker walls and fewer drafts. As darkness settles fully, you light a small lantern. Its glow barely reaches the rough wall shadows dancing in uneven patterns. The light feels fragile, but it is enough. Many settlers describe their first dugout nights as a mix of relief and fear. Relief at being out of the wind. Fear that the earth might give way. Every creak or settling sound feels amplified. You lie down on the packed dirt floor, exhaustion weighing heavier than the cold. Your body radiates heat into the ground, and the ground gives some of it back slower and steadier than the air ever could. This exchange becomes familiar over time. The earth is not warm, but it is fair. It does not steal heat aggressively. It simply shares it at its own pace. Outside, frost forms on grass and tools left behind. Inside, your breath still clouds, but your fingers regain some feeling. You curl slightly instinctively, conserving warmth. This is how people learned night after night, through sensation rather than instruction. The stubborn hope that carried settlers into these dugouts was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and often tinged with doubt. Yet it was enough to keep shovels moving and walls rising. As you drift toward uneasy sleep, surrounded by raw earth, you realize that survival here is built one shovel of dirt at a time, and tonight that is enough. You ease yourself fully inside the dugout as night finally takes possession of the plains. The opening above you shrinks to a square of darkening sky, and then even that fades as you pull a rough covering partway across it. The change is immediate. The wind that bullied you all day loses its teeth down here. It still exists, you can hear it rushing past the surface, but it no longer has direct access to your skin. For the first time since sunset, your shoulders loosen. The darkness is thick, not empty. It presses gently like a heavy blanket made of soil and silence. Your ears strain at first, trying to map this new space. Every small sound feels important. A scrape of dirt settling, the soft rasp of your own breathing. Period journals from frontier families often mention this moment the first night underground as strangely disorienting. People were used to hearing the world at night. In a dugout, the world goes quiet, and that quiet can feel unsettling before it feels safe. You shift your weight on the packed earth floor, testing for comfort. There is very little. Still, the cold feels different here. It does not stab. It seeps. That distinction matters more than you expect. Above ground, cold attacks from every angle. Down here it creeps slowly, giving your body time to respond. This was one of the reasons dugouts persisted, even when settlers could afford something better. The temperature did not swing wildly, and at night predictability could mean sleep. An unusual habit appears in several personal accounts. Some settlers would deliberately leave the dugout door or roof opening uncovered for a short time before sleep letting frigid air rush in. They believed this made the space feel warmer later once sealed. Whether this actually worked or simply reassured them is unclear, but it shows how closely people paid attention to temperature shifts. They experimented constantly even while exhausted. You pull your coat tighter and lie still waiting for your body to decide whether it can rest. The smell of earth fills your nose, damp and grounding. It is the scent of something that does not move quickly, and that steadiness begins to calm you. You imagine how terrifying this first night must have felt to someone new to the plains. No solid walls, no real roof yet. Just dirt and hope between you and the elements. Researchers remain divided on whether dugouts offered true psychological comfort or merely physical protection. Some argue the enclosed space heightened anxiety, especially during storms. Others point out that many settlers reported sleeping better underground than they ever did in tents or wagons. Lying here now, you can feel both truths. The safety is real. So is the vulnerability. Your breath clouds faintly in the lantern light, then fades as you turn the flame low. Fire is a risk here. Too much smoke and you could suffocate. Too little heat and the cold creeps back. Managing that balance becomes a nightly skill. Early settlers learned quickly that underground living required constant awareness even while resting. Outside, the prairie temperature drops fast. Frost stiffens the grass and ice begins forming on anything exposed. Down here, you sense the change only as a gradual tightening in the air. This lag is everything. It gives you time to curl inward to conserve warmth. People often slept fully dressed boots and all on nights like this. There was no romance in undressing when survival was the goal. A lesser-known detail from homestead letters is how people oriented themselves for sleep. Many chose to rest with their feet toward the entrance, believing it kept their core warmer and made it easier to react if something went wrong. Practical thinking never fully shut off, even in exhaustion. You lie still now, listening to the earth settle around you. Tiny sounds ripple through the walls as the soil adjusts to the cold above. It is not threatening, just alive in its own slow way. The dugout is not a tomb, despite how it might look from the outside. It breathes, expands and contracts. There is no consensus among historians on how long it took settlers to stop feeling afraid in these spaces. For some, it happened within nights. For others, never. Fear did not always fade, but familiarity often softened it. You begin to feel that softening now as your body accepts this new normal. Sleep comes in fragments at first. You drift, wake, listen, then drift again. Each time you wake, you're still alive, still sheltered. That realization builds quiet confidence. The coldest nights of the Wild West do not defeat people all at once. They test them gradually, hour by hour. As the night deepens, the dugout holds. The wind cannot reach you. The stars wheel unseen overhead. And in this pocket of darkness and dirt, you begin to understand how people endured. Not comfortably, not bravely in the storybook sense, but steadily, patiently, one long night at a time. Morning never really announces itself down here. You wake because your body decides it is time, not because light floods in or birds start up. The cold has a flatter edge now, less biting than the night before, and that alone feels like proof of concept. You shift joints stiff and notice something important. You made it through the night. The dugout did what it promised. Not warmth exactly, but protection. As you sit up brushing dirt from your sleeve, you start to understand why so many settlers quietly concluded that a hole in the ground beat a house made of logs, at least during winter. Contemporary frontier manuals and land office reports observed that earth-sheltered homes maintained a more even temperature than surface structures. Wood heats and cools quickly. Earth does not. That difference plays out slowly over hours, which is exactly what you need. When the sun disappears early and returns late, you picture a wooden cabin on this same stretch of land. Wind slips through every seam no matter how carefully it is built. Boards shrink in dry cold, opening gaps you did not know were there. Fire burns fast, devouring precious fuel just to keep the interior from freezing solid. In contrast, the dugout surrounds you with mass. The walls absorb heat during the day and release it reluctantly at night. It is not cozy, but it is efficient. There is a curious observation recorded in several settler letters. People noticed that dugouts felt cooler than cabins during the day and warmer at night, a reversal that took some getting used to. This meant you sometimes shivered at noon and relaxed after sunset. It went against instinct, but bodies adapted. Over time, people adjusted their routines, working above ground during warmer daylight hours and retreating underground early. You run your hand along the wall again, feeling how thick it is. Thickness matters more than material out here. Logs might look sturdy, but a foot of compacted earth outperforms them when it comes to blocking cold. This is why even settlers who built cabins often dug cellars or half-basements beneath them. They were borrowing the dugout logic without fully admitting it. Interpretations still differ among researchers about whether dugouts were a superior long-term solution or merely a seasonal compromise. Some argue they represented an intelligent adaptation perfectly suited to the plains. Others see them as a stopgap tolerated only until railroads brought lumber and coal. Sitting here now, it feels less like theory and more like lived reality. When the cold presses in, effectiveness outweighs ideals. An unusual workaround shows up in a handful of accounts. Some families built partial cabins directly over their dugouts, using the underground space as the main living area in winter and the above-ground room in summer. This hybrid approach let them chase comfort vertically moving up or down depending on the season. It was not elegant, but it worked. You think about airflow now because warmth underground depends on balance. Too sealed and moisture builds. Too open and heat escapes. Dugout entrances were often small for this reason, sometimes little more than a low doorway you had to stoop through. Every inch of opening was a negotiation with the cold. You step outside, briefly squinting against the pale winter sun. The air slices immediately, reminding you how thin your margin is. You retreat back inside without hesitation. That instinct settles quickly in people who live through even one serious prairie winter. You learn where safety lives. Another detail emerges as you consider fire. In a cabin, heat rises and escapes. In a dugout, it lingers closer to where you sleep and sit. Even a small stove or lamp can shift the balance noticeably. That efficiency meant less fuel burned overnight, a critical advantage where fuel was scarce. The ground under you stays firm, holding its temperature, holding you. You realize that dugouts did not win people over because they were pleasant. They won because they were dependable. Dependability becomes a kind of comfort all its own. When nights stretch long and cold, knowing what to expect matters more than luxury. You lie back again, letting the steady quiet wrap around you. The earth does not creak like wood or whistle like canvas. It simply exists. That constancy becomes a companion during the coldest nights. Above ground, the prairie remains vast and indifferent. Down here, the world feels smaller, slower, and survivable. As you close your eyes once more, you understand why so many settlers, when asked later about dugouts, spoke with a surprising lack of bitterness. They were not proud of them, but they respected them. The ground kept its word. And in a place where winter broke many promises, that was enough. You reach for another layer before the cold reminds you to. That reflex comes quickly now. Underground living teaches anticipation. You learn to stay ahead of the temperature rather than react to it. Blankets become tools, not comforts. You stack them with intention, thinking about where heat escapes first, where your body's weakest. Frontier supply lists and household inventories frequently noted the value of buffalo robes, thick wool quilts, and patched blankets. These items were treated less like bedding and more like essential equipment. Buffalo hides in particular were prized for their density and ability to block drafts. Even after bison populations declined, older robes stayed in use for decades, passed down and repaired repeatedly. You spread layers beneath you as well as over you. Cold rises from the ground as reliably as it falls from the air. People learn to insulate both directions. Straw, old clothing, even newspapers were used to create barriers. There is a peculiar detail recorded in a few homestead memoirs. Some settlers stuffed dried grass or corn husks inside pillowcases to add insulation. It was not soft, but it trapped warmth better than air alone. You pull a robe around your shoulders and feel the weight of it settle. Heavy is good. Light fabrics flutter and leak heat. Weight presses warmth closer to your body. This is why people often preferred fewer heavier coverings rather than many thin ones. It simplified the nightly routine. Lay it down, wrap it tight, do not let gaps form. Scholars remain split on how effective these layered systems truly were without modern insulation. Some argue that body heat and dense materials created a microclimate that significantly reduced heat loss. Others suggest the benefit was modest and mostly psychological. Lying here now, you suspect both played a role. Feeling protected helps the body relax, and relaxation conserves energy. Fire enters the equation carefully. A small stove or lantern changes everything, but it also introduces risk. You position heat sources low, aware that warmth pools near the floor in a dugout rather than racing upward. This quirk of underground spaces made even weak fires feel more effective than they would in a cabin. An odd belief shows up in a handful of letters. Some settlers thought sleeping with their heads covered, even partially, could trap heat better. Others warned it was dangerous, fearing bad air. There was no single rule, only trial and error. You tuck a blanket close but leave your face free, choosing caution over maximum warmth. You notice how smell becomes part of the warmth equation. Wool hide and earth mix into a scent that signals shelter. It is not pleasant, but it is familiar. Familiarity calms the mind. Calm slows breathing. Slower breathing conserves heat. These small connections mattered more than people realized at the time. You shift slightly, careful not to break the seal of your blankets. Movement costs warmth. Settlers learned to settle into stillness early. Nighttime was for conserving energy, not tossing and turning. Children were taught this instinctively bundled together, so that shared heat did some of the work. Records from the period show that bedding was often the most expensive household investment a family owned. It outlasted furniture and tools. In winter, it outperformed them too. A good blanket could mean the difference between waking stiff and waking alive. There is disagreement among historians about whether settlers truly slept well in these conditions or simply endured. Many accounts describe restless nights, half sleep and frequent waking. Others speak of deep exhaustion that pulled them under despite the cold. You feel both possibilities here. Your body wants rest. The chill keeps nudging you awake. You tuck your feet deeper into the layers, protecting toes first. Frostbite did not announce itself loudly. Numbness was the warning, and people paid attention. Blankets were adjusted throughout the night, small corrections made in the dark. As the dugout settles around you, the layered defences do their quiet work. They do not defeat the cold, but they slow it, soften it, make it manageable. In this space, warmth is not a single source. It is a collaboration between earth fabric, fire, and flesh. You breathe slowly, wrapped and weighted, letting your muscles loosen. The coldest nights demand respect, not bravado. And here, under layers of borrowed warmth, you learn how people lasted until morning night, after long night, by turning whatever they had into something just warm enough. You turn your attention to the stove because warmth without fire rarely lasts through the deepest part of the night. The metal box squats in the corner of the dugout like an unreliable companion, useful, but demanding constant attention. You crouch low to feed it, careful not to bump the pipe that snakes upward through the roof. Even a small shift can loosen the seal, and that invites smoke where you do not want it. Frontier household accounts often describe these stoves as temperamental at best. Many were second-hand hauled hundreds of miles patched with whatever could be found. Some burned wood, others coal, others anything that would smoulder. Fuel choice was rarely ideal. It was whatever you could get your hands on before winter closed in. You strike a match and coax a flame to life, watching it struggle before catching. Heat seeps out slowly, almost shyly. In a dugout, even this modest warmth feels significant. The fire does not have to fight rising air. It spreads outward, pooling near the floor where you sit and sleep. That quirk made underground heating surprisingly efficient, even when the stove itself was barely cooperative. An offbeat solution appears in a few remembered stories. When stoves failed, some settlers heated stones outside in a fire and brought them in, wrapping them in cloth to prevent burns. The stones radiated warmth for hours, a temporary fix that required planning and strong arms. It was not comfortable, but it bought time. Managing smoke becomes its own nightly ritual. You adjust the damper, listening for the change in draft. Too much draw and the fire burns out fast. Too little, and smoke curls back into the room. Dugouts trapped smoke easily, and people learned the hard way. Period medical reports noted cases of headaches and nausea linked to poor ventilation, a quiet reminder that warmth could be dangerous. You kneel and check the pipe again, sealing gaps with damp earth if needed. Dirt makes a surprisingly effective sealant when nothing else is available. It dries slowly, holds shape, and can be scraped away later. These improvised fixes were common, born of necessity rather than design. There is no universal agreement among historians about how safe these heating setups truly were. Some argue the risk of fire and suffocation outweighed the benefits. Others point out that people adapted quickly, developing routines that minimize danger. Sitting here now, you feel the tension between comfort and caution in every adjustment you make. You let the fire settle into a low burn. Overnight heat is about endurance, not blaze. A roaring fire eats fuel and demands attention. A quiet one hums along, giving just enough warmth to take the edge off. You arrange kindling within reach, so you do not have to leave your blankets later. Another little-known habit surfaces in winter recollections. Some families took turns staying awake during the coldest hours, tending the stove while others slept. This watch system reduced risk and spread exhaustion more evenly. It turned warmth into a shared responsibility. The smell of smoke lingers faintly, mixing with earth and wool. You learn to read that smell to know when it's safe and when it signals trouble. Scent becomes an early warning system just as important as sight or sound. You settle back, feeling the temperature shift subtly. It is not dramatic, but your fingers relax. Your breathing deepens. Fire here is not about comfort. It is about maintaining a fragile balance. Enough heat to keep blood moving, not so much that the air turns against you. As the night deepens, the stove ticks softly as metal expands and contracts. That sound becomes familiar, almost reassuring. It means the fire is alive. It means the cold has competition. You keep one ear tuned even as your eyes close. Underground living trains you to sleep lightly, ready to respond. The coldest nights demand vigilance, but they also teach restraint. You cannot fight winter head-on. You manage it, negotiate with it, keep it at bay just long enough. Wrapped in blankets, warmed by stubborn embers, you drift towards sleep again. The stove does its imperfect job, and imperfect is enough. People did not survive these nights because everything worked well. They survived because they paid attention, adjusted constantly, and accepted that warmth here was always conditional. You wake to the sound of your own breath, sharp and faintly crackling, as if the air itself has stiffened overnight. The dugout is darker now, the fire reduced to a memory of warmth rather than the source of it. You inhale slowly and feel the cold slide into your lungs, not painfully but with authority. This is the kind of cold that does not shout. It settles in and waits. Letters written during severe winters often mention this sensation. People described breathing as work, especially just before dawn, when temperatures dip to their lowest. Moisture in the air condensed with every exhale, forming a faint frost on blankets' hair and the walls themselves. You lift your hand and brush at your sleeve, feeling a crust where warmth once was. The cold has weight now. It presses on your chest, makes movement feel expensive. You learn quickly not to rush. Sudden motion burns energy and invites shivering, which wastes heat. Instead, you roll slowly onto your side, pulling blankets tighter in practiced motions. These small rituals become second nature after only a few nights. One strangely common practice appears in multiple winter accounts. People slept with scarves or cloths loosely tied over their mouths to warm incoming air. It was not airtight, just enough to take the edge off each breath. Some swore by it. Others found it claustrophobic. There was no single rule, only what worked for you. You listened to the quiet. The dugout seems to hold its breath with you. Above ground, the prairie is locked in ice, but down here the stillness feels thicker, more complete. Sound does not travel well through frozen earth. Even the wind feels muted, like it is happening in another world. Observers at the time noted that cold affected sleep as much as hunger did. People drifted in and out, waking frequently to check fingers and toes, to adjust coverings, to confirm that the fire had not died completely. Deep uninterrupted sleep was rare in the heart of winter. Survival did not require restfulness, it required persistence. You flex your fingers inside your mittens, grateful for the faint ache that tells you they are still responsive. Numbness is the real enemy. Settlers learn to fear it quietly, checking extremities the way sailors check the horizon, calmly, regularly. There is debate among modern researchers about how much damage these repeated cold exposures caused long-term. Some suggest chronic joint pain and respiratory issues were common consequences. Others argue that people acclimated more than we assume. Sitting here now, you feel the body adapting in real time, conserving heat, slowing everything down. The air smells sharper than before, tinged with cold metal and ash. You reach out and touch the stove. It is cold, completely spent. Relighting it will have to wait until daylight strengthens. Matches were precious. So was fuel. Morning fires were deliberate decisions, not habits. Another unusual detail surfaces in winter recollections. Some settlers kept a small candle burning all night, not for heat, but to prevent total darkness. They believed it helped them wake more easily and reduce panic during sudden cold snaps. The flame did little physically, but mentally it mattered. You tuck your chin down and breathe shallowly, warming the air before it reaches deeper. This becomes instinctive. Your body learns how to meet the cold halfway. The dugout does not eliminate hardship. It stretches it out, gives you space to respond. As the hours crawl toward dawn, you sense the temperature shift again, barely perceptible. The cold plateaus, then hesitates. Soon the sun will climb weak but present, and the worst will pass for another day. That knowledge steadies you. You remain still, wrapped and waiting, breath fogging and fading. The coldest part of the night does not defeat you because you do not fight it. You endure it quietly underground, letting the earth slow the world, just enough for you to keep breathing until morning finds you again. You're not alone down here, even when it feels that way. As the cold presses in again after midnight, bodies begin to matter as much as blankets or fire. You shift closer to the others, sharing this space, aware that warmth moves from one person to the next without asking permission. In these moments, privacy becomes a luxury you cannot afford. Household accounts from the plains frequently describe families sleeping together in winter regardless of age. Children were placed between adults. Elders were kept closest to the warmest part of the room. This was not sentimentality. It was strategy. Human bodies radiate heat steadily, and when arranged carefully, they create a shared reservoir that no single person could manage alone. You feel the difference almost immediately. The air between bodies warms, losing its bite. Breathing becomes easier. Muscles unclench slightly. People learn to position themselves with intention, shoulder-to-shoulder feet, overlapping, minimizing exposed space. These arrangements changed nightly depending on who was sick, who was strongest, who needed the most protection. A lesser remembered habit appears in some winter journals. Families sometimes rotated sleeping positions through the night, gently waking one another to redistribute warmth. It sounds exhausting, but it prevented any one person from cooling too much. Even half asleep, people watched out for each other in small, practical ways. Children adapt fastest. They curl naturally, tucking limbs inward, pressing close without self-consciousness. Elders take longer to warm and cool faster, so they are surrounded, layered in both fabric and flesh. You become aware of how age changes the relationship with cold. What is uncomfortable for one person can be dangerous for another. Medical observers in frontier communities noted that shared sleeping reduced incidents of frostbite indoors, particularly among the young. This was not framed as science at the time, just common sense confirmed by experience. Warmth was communal. Survival often was too. You listened to breathing around you, the slow rhythm of others drifting in and out of shallow sleep. Sound becomes reassurance. Silence would mean trouble. A cough is checked. A restless shift prompts a hand to reach out, adjusting a blanket without words. These gestures replace conversation in the dark. There is still uncertainty among scholars about how emotionally taxing this loss of personal space was, especially for adults accustomed to privacy. Some accounts hint at tension and discomfort. Others describe a surprising sense of closeness forged by necessity. Lying here now, you feel both. The warmth helps, the crowding presses. You think about how cold reorganizes social rules. Hierarchies soften, practicality takes over. Who sleeps where is decided by need, not preference. Pride gives way quickly when toes go numb. The dugout becomes a small ecosystem, every body a component in a fragile balance. Another detail surfaces from letters written years later. Some settlers recalled these shared nights with unexpected fondness, even gratitude. The cold forced intimacy that daily life did not. It reminded people that survival was not an individual achievement. It was collective. You adjust slightly, careful not to break contact. Movement is slow and deliberate. Even small gaps invite cold to rush in. People learn to move as a unit, responding to shifts without fully waking. It is a skill developed through repetition, not instruction. The air grows warmer by degrees, just enough to dull the sharpest edge. You feel your own heat contributing, not just receiving. That realization carries weight. You're not just being protected, you are part of the protection. There is disagreement among historians about whether this reliance on shared warmth increased the spread of illness. Close quarters certainly made it easier for sickness to pass. At the same time, cold weakened immune systems, making isolation just as risky. People balance these dangers without fully understanding them, guided by immediate need rather than theory. As the night stretches on, the dugout becomes a single breathing organism. Heat circulates slowly. Cold presses from the walls but does not break through. You remain half awake, half dreaming, aware of every presence around you. When dawn finally begins to lift the dark, you realize how much the night depended on cooperation. No single blanket, no single stove, no single body could have held off the cold alone. It was the quiet closeness, the shared endurance that carried everyone through. You stay still a moment longer, letting the warmth linger before the day begins. The cold will return tonight. It always does. But now you know that surviving it is not just about shelter. It's about bodies pressed together in the dark, breathing in time, waiting patiently for light. You notice it most in the quiet moments when everyone else has finally settled, and the dugout seems to pause with you. The cold does not care who did the work that day, or who is most tired. Yet someone has to keep this place functioning, and more often than not that burden settles on the same shoulders night after night. You feel it in the small tasks that never quite end. Before sleep can even be considered, there is work. Water hauled earlier must be checked to be sure it is not frozen solid. Food is moved closer to the warmest part of the space so it stays edible by morning. Damp clothing is repositioned again, hung where it might catch a little warmth without stealing too much from the fire. These tasks shape whether the night will be merely uncomfortable or actively dangerous. Letters written by women on the plains reveal how much of this labour happened quietly without ceremony. They describe nights spent half awake, listening, adjusting, anticipating. The cold demanded planning. Forgetting to dry mittens or letting water freeze could ripple into the next day, compounding fatigue and risk. Survival was cumulative. You reach out and shift a bundle of clothes closer to the stove, careful not to block airflow. The movement is practiced almost automatic. This is the kind of knowledge that does not come from instruction manuals. It comes from nights that went wrong, from mornings that began with numb fingers or cracked skin. An oddly persistent habit appears in some of these accounts. Women tucked small personal items into bedding: a spoon, a button, a scrap of cloth, not for warmth, but for reassurance. In a place where everything felt provisional, these objects anchored identity. They made the dugout feel less like a hole and more like a home, even if only for a few hours at night. You listen as someone stirs and mutters in their sleep. A blanket slips. Without thinking, you reach to pull it back into place. This kind of care becomes invisible over time. It is not recognized as labor because it leaves no obvious mark. Yet it is the difference between a restful night and a miserable one. Observers writing later about frontier life often overlooked this nightly maintenance, focusing instead on buildings, crops, and men with tools. Yet diaries tell another story. They show how much energy went into simply managing cold, especially after dark. The dugout did not run itself. It required constant attention. You think about how exhaustion layers on exhaustion. Days were long, filled with hauling, cooking, tending animals. Nights did not offer full relief. They offered vigilance. This was especially true in winter when the margin for error shrank to almost nothing. There is disagreement among historians about how this burden shaped family dynamics long term. Some see evidence of deep resilience and shared purpose. Others note signs of strain, resentment, and burnout. Lying here now, you sense both possibilities coexisting. Care can strengthen bonds. It can also wear them thin. The cold makes these dynamics sharper. There is no space to ignore small problems. A missed task echoes loudly in the night. A forgotten chore can mean frozen water, wasted fuel, or illness. Responsibility becomes constant. You finally allow yourself to lie back, listening to the steady breathing around you. Even now, part of your mind stays alert, tracking temperature, sound, movement. Sleep comes in light waves, never fully pulling you under. The dugout holds, but only because someone keeps adjusting its balance. That work is rarely remembered, yet it is everywhere. In the way blankets are layered just right. In the way the fire is coaxed to last. In the way children and elders wake warmer than they would otherwise. As the night stretches on, you feel the quiet pride that comes from competence. Not the loud pride of conquest, but the steady kind that says you kept everyone safe until morning. In the coldest nights of the Wild West, that kind of labour mattered more than anything built in daylight. You close your eyes again, knowing dawn will come whether you rest or not. The earth around you stays still. The cold waits patiently, and you, wrapped in quiet responsibility, drift as deeply as this place allows. You notice the smell before anything else, a warm, sour edge drifting in from just beyond the wall. It is not unpleasant, just unmistakably alive. Animals are closer than comfort might normally allow, and tonight you are grateful for that. On the plains, warmth sometimes has 4 legs and a steady heartbeat. Many dugouts were built into hillsides that backed onto small shelters for livestock. Settlement sketches and farm layouts from the era show humans and animals arranged in tight proximity, not out of affection but necessity. A cow, a horse, even a cluster of chickens gave off heat constantly. That heat leaked through shared walls, floors, and packed earth, subtly lifting the temperature inside the dugout. You press your palm against the wall and imagine the warmth seeping through slowly. It is not dramatic. It is incremental. A few degrees can mean the difference between restless shivering and shallow sleep. People learn to position shelters, carefully placing animal pens uphill or adjacent when possible, so warmth drifted naturally downward and inward. One unexpectedly common solution appears in winter recollections. During extreme cold snaps, smaller animals were brought directly inside. Chickens in crates, lambs wrapped in cloth, even pigs on occasion, their breath steaming in the dim light. It was chaotic, noisy, and messy, but it worked. Animals did not mind the dark. People minded the cold more. You hear a muffled shift outside, the scrape of hooves, the low sound of an animal settling its weight. That sound is oddly reassuring. It means life is still moving, still generating warmth. Silence from the animals would be far more worrying. Veterinary notes and agricultural advice from the period warned against overcrowding, yet winter often forced compromise. Animals suffered from cold too, and keeping them close protected everyone. This shared vulnerability blurred the line between shelter for humans and shelter for beasts. There is no settled agreement among historians on how widespread indoor animal keeping truly was. Some argue it was rare and exaggerated in memory. Others point to numerous first-hand descriptions suggesting it was common during the harshest winters. From inside the dugout, the debate feels distant. What matters is that on certain nights, warmth came from wherever it could. You adjust your position, aware of the faint vibration travelling through the wall as an animal shifts again. The ground carries that motion gently like a low hum. It reminds you that the earth connects everything here. Heat, sound, movement all travel through it. The air smells thicker now, layered with hayhide and breath. It is not clean, but it is alive. People adapted quickly to these smells, associating them with safety rather than discomfort. Cold rewires, preferences in subtle ways. You think about the trust involved. Animals are unpredictable. They kick, they shift, they panic. Yet in winter that risk was accepted. The cold was more dangerous than a startled goat. Choices like this were not sentimental, they were calculated. As the night deepens, the shared warmth becomes more noticeable. The dugout feels less hollow, more inhabited. Heat pools slowly, stubbornly, refusing to be rushed, but willing to stay once established. You drift closer to sleep, comforted by the presence beyond the wall. Life pressed against life, sharing what it can. On the coldest nights, survival is rarely elegant. It smells like animals and earth and smoke. It sounds like breathing and shuffling and low, steady movement. You let your eyes close, listening to that rhythm. The animals outside settle. The cold pauses at the boundary you have built together, and for now that is enough to carry you through until morning. You feel it before you see it. A chill that does not move like air, dampness that settles rather than blows. Moisture is the quiet rival of cold in a dugout, and it works patiently. The walls sweat as temperatures shift and the floor never truly dries. Even when the fire has burned for hours, the earth remembers water. Settler correspondents from wet winters often complained less about freezing and more about rot. Shoes softened, blankets grew heavy, wooden supports darkened and warped. People learned that staying warm meant staying dry, and staying dry underground was a constant negotiation. You run your fingers along the wall and feel the cool slickness beneath the surface dust. This is not danger yet, but it is a warning. You reposition bedding again, lifting it onto a low platform made of boards or packed sod. Elevation matters. Anything touching the floor draws moisture like a sponge. Raising sleeping areas by even a few inches changed how the night felt. Period sketches of dugout interiors often show beds perched on crates or simple frames, not for comfort but for survival. A curious workaround shows up in multiple winter recollections. Some settlers scattered dry ashes across the floor to absorb dampness. Others used sand or crushed charcoal. These materials soaked up moisture and could be swept out later. It was messy, but it worked well enough to keep mold from taking over completely. The smell shifts as dampness increases. Earth becomes sharper, more metallic. Wool holds onto moisture stubbornly, and wet wool steals heat fast. You check your blankets by touch rather than sight, feeling for cold spots. Anything damp gets moved closer to the stove, even if it means rearranging the entire space. Health officers visiting frontier settlements occasionally noted respiratory complaints linked to persistent damp conditions. Coughs lingered. Chests felt tight. While cold was blamed, moisture played its own role. You sense that now as you breathe the air heavier clinging to your lungs. Opinions vary among researchers about whether dugouts were inherently unhealthy or simply mismanaged in extreme conditions. Some argue proper drainage and ventilation made them livable long-term. Others point to repeated mentions of mold and sickness as evidence of structural flaws. From inside the space, the truth feels practical rather than theoretical. Dampness demands constant attention. You crack the entrance slightly, just enough to let stale air creep out without inviting a rush of cold. This balance is delicate. Too much ventilation and you lose heat. Too little, and moisture builds until everything feels clammy. People learn to adjust openings throughout the night, responding to shifts in temperature and humidity almost unconsciously. Another lesser-known habit appears in winter diaries. Some settlers stored salt in open containers to absorb moisture from the air. It works slowly, quietly, drawing dampness into itself. Salt was precious, but losing a bit to keep bedding dry was considered worth it. You listen to the faint drip somewhere near the wall, water finding its way down through packed earth. It is not dramatic, just persistent. You place a shallow pan beneath it, another small correction in a night full of them. Dugout living is a series of adjustments, none of them heroic, all of them necessary. The fire helps, but only to a point. Heat drives moisture upward where it condenses again on the ceiling, drops form and fall unpredictably. People learn to angle roofs and hang cloths to redirect drips away from sleeping areas. Nothing stays dry forever, but you can slow the process. You settle back, aware that comfort here is temporary by nature. Dryness is borrowed time. The earth gives shelter, but it also insists on reminding you of its presence. This is the price of hiding underground. As the night moves on, the air stabilizes slightly. Your efforts pay off in small ways. Blankets feel lighter. Breathing feels easier. These changes are subtle, but you notice them because you have to. The coldest nights are not only about temperature, they are about managing everything that comes with it. Moisture, mold, smell, and sickness all circle quietly, waiting for neglect. Survival depends on noticing them early. You close your eyes again, listening to the slow drip, the soft crackle of ash settling. The dugout is imperfect, but it is holding. You're dry enough, warm enough, awake enough to make it through. Tomorrow the damp will return. It always does. But tonight you have kept it in check, one small decision at a time, and in this underground space that steady vigilance is what lets you rest at all. You wake to a pressure rather than a sound. The dugout feels smaller somehow, as if the walls have leaned inward while you slept. Then you realize it is the snow. Heavy, layered, relentless. It has been falling for hours, packing itself against the earth above you, sealing cracks, softening edges, changing how the world moves. Snowstorms out here do not rage so much as smother. When you sit up, the silence is startling. Even the wind seems to have been wrapped in cloth. Snow absorbs noise, and underground that effect doubles. You expect to hear the prairie breathing, but instead there is only the faintest murmur, like the land itself has decided to sleep in. Early travellers across the plains often wrote about this quiet, how storms erased distance and direction, turning the world into something blank and enclosed. You feel a strange mix of comfort and unease. Snow is insulation. Packed thickly enough it traps air and slows heat loss. You have heard people say that the coldest nights sometimes felt warmer during a storm, and now you understand why. The dugout holds its temperature more stubbornly wrapped in white. At the same time, snow brings weight. It presses down on roofs and entrances, testing whatever you built in a hurry. You reach for the lantern and lift it carefully. Shadows crawl across the walls, revealing faint cracks where moisture has frozen into pale lines. The roof creaks softly as the structure adjusts to the load. That sound sharpens your attention instantly. People learn to listen for changes like this. A new creak meant snow shifting. A dull thump could mean a partial collapse outside. Silence after noise was sometimes the most worrying sign of all. You remember stories of storms that buried doors, completely leaving families to dig themselves out from inside. It was not dramatic like in movies. It was slow, methodical, exhausting work done in cramped spaces with limited air. Snowstorms were not just about cold. They were about containment. You pull on extra layers and check the entrance. The door resists when you push. Snow has drifted against it, sealing the gap. You do not force it yet. Panic wastes energy. Instead, you mark the problem and return to the center of the space. People survive storms by pacing themselves, not by reacting all at once. The air feels heavier now, still and close. Ventilation matters more during storms when snow blocks openings and smoke has nowhere to go. You adjust the flue slightly, watching how the flame responds. A steady burn tells you the draft still exists. That small confirmation settles your nerves. You listen again. No voices. No animals moving nearby. Storms quiet everything equally. The prairie becomes a held breath. For some, this silence was calming. For others, it felt like being erased. Diaries from long winters often mention how storms blurred time, turning hours into something shapeless. You think about the psychological weight of being underground during a blizzard. You cannot see what is happening. You cannot judge progress by sight. All you have are sounds and sensations. Trust becomes internal. You trust the roof. You trust the walls. You trust that the snow will stop before it becomes too much. There were people who reinforced their dugouts specifically for storms, adding extra layers of sod or brush to the roof before winter set in. Others relied on luck and maintenance, clearing snow when they could and hoping for the best. Which approach worked better depended on countless variables from snowfall type to soil stability. Living here meant accepting that not everything could be controlled. An image returns to you of someone tapping the roof gently with a stick from inside, listening for hollowness. Snow changes sound, packed snow dulls it. Thin spots ring differently. This kind of listening became instinctive, a way of reading danger without seeing it. The temperature inside holds steady, neither improving nor worsening. Snow has locked the world in place. You huddle with others, sharing warmth again, speaking softly if at all. Voices feel too loud in this quiet. Even children sense it, their movements slower, their play subdued. Time stretches, you eat sparingly. Food feels less important than conserving heat and air. People often rationed during storms, not because supplies were gone, but because movement cost warmth. Every choice became about balance. You doze in fragments, waking to check the roof, the fire, the entrance. Each time things are the same, holding. Snowstorms taught patience more than courage. You could not fight them. You waited them out. At some point the silence shifts. It is subtle, but you feel it. The weight above eases slightly. Snow settles, stops falling, begins the long process of becoming still. The world does not return all at once. It seeps back in. You test the door again. It gives a little this time. Not free, but promising. Morning will require digging, clearing, restoring airflow. That work can wait until light strengthens. for now the danger has passed. You lie back, exhausted but relieved. The dugout did its job again, not by being strong, but by being hidden. Snowstorms that raced landmarks and swallowed wagons passed over you without finding a target. Underground, you were not something the storm could grab. As sleep finally deepens, you realize how much of survival here depended on letting the land change around you while you stayed still. The storm reshaped the prairie overnight. Drifts formed. Paths vanished. But inside the dugout, life paused, and then continued. When you wake again, the snow will glitter briefly, then begin to melt, revealing the world piece by piece. Tonight, though wrapped in silence and earth, you let the storm finish without you watching it. And that too is how people survived. You push the door open in the morning and the cold air rushes in like it has been waiting politely outside. Snow piles up against the threshold and you step into it with a quiet sigh, already thinking about what has to happen next. The dugout kept you alive through the storm, but now the day asks for its own kind of endurance. Clothing especially becomes a problem you cannot ignore. Your boots feel heavy the moment you lift them. Leather stiffens in the cold, and if it got wet yesterday, it is now half frozen. You flex your toes and feel the dull protest of cramped space and stiff fabric. People who lived through these winters wrote again and again about clothing that never truly dried, and you understand why. In a dugout, heat is limited and moisture lingers. Every garment becomes a slow-moving battle between dampness and warmth. You bring your coat closer to the stove and touch the sleeve. It is cold and slightly clammy. Drying clothes indoors sounds easy until you realize how little air circulation you have. Hang them too close to the stove, and you risk scorching or even fire. Hang them too far and they stay wet, stealing heat from your body all night. So you compromise, placing items in a ring around the stove like planets around a small stubborn sun. The smell of damp wool rises. It is sharp, almost sour, and it sticks to the walls. You notice how that smell becomes part of winter memory, as distinctive as smoke or soil. Wool is warm even when wet, which is why it was so common, but wet wool also feels like wearing a cold sponge. You can survive in it, but it will not let you forget the cold for even a moment. You think about mittens first. Hands matter. Without warm hands, you cannot cut wood, haul water, light a fire, or fix a roof. Yet mittens are easily soaked by snow, by washing, by sweat. People often kept spare pairs if they could, and if they could not, they improvised. Some lined mittens with scraps of fur or folded cloth. Others wore socks on their hands in desperation. The goal was simple: keep skin from direct contact with frozen air. You hold your boots upside down and tap them, listening for ice inside. It falls out in small chunks. There is a small relief in that sound, the kind of relief you get when you discover a problem is at least visible. Boots were not just footwear here, they were survival gear. Frostbite in toes could end a season, even a life, because it reduced your ability to work. So you treat boots like precious tools, drying them slowly, stuffing them with straw or paper, if you have it anything that can absorb moisture and hold shape. You remember hearing that some people warmed boots by placing heated stones inside them. It sounds risky, and it is, but on a morning when you cannot feel your feet, risk starts to look like opportunity. You imagine the careful routine heating stones outside, wrapping them, sliding them into boots, watching for smoke or scorch marks. This is the sort of ingenuity that grows quietly in winter, not from creativity but from necessity. You also learn that clothes do not just keep you warm, they keep you organized. Layers become a system, an inner layer that stays dry if possible, a middle layer that traps heat, an outer layer that blocks wind and snow. Even without modern materials, people understood this in their bones. They might not have used the word layering, but they lived it. Shirts, vests, coats, shawls, scarves, aprons. Each piece added a little more time before cold reached skin. Inside the dugout, you watch your breath fog as you move. You try to dry a shirt by holding it near the stove, but the warmth is so modest that it feels like drying laundry with a candle. Still, you do it because you have to. The alternative is wearing damp clothing into the night and letting your own body heat spend itself evaporating moisture instead of keeping your core warm. You begin to understand why people often change clothes less frequently in winter. Washing meant wet fabric, and wet fabric meant danger. Cleanliness was not ignored out of laziness. It was traded for warmth. That trade could be uncomfortable, even embarrassing, but winter does not care about manners. The dugout itself makes drying harder. The air is still. Moisture has nowhere to go. You open the door a crack to let dampness escape, then close it again quickly when the cold rushes in too sharply. You do this repeatedly, like a slow breathing cycle for the room. Vent, seal, vent, seal. Over time, you develop a sense for how much cold you can allow in without losing all progress. You look at your hands red and cracked and realize clothing is not just fabric. It is protection for skin that is constantly under threat. People used grease oils, even homemade salves to keep skin from splitting. Gloves helped, but nothing was perfect. Winter left marks. It taught patience through discomfort. By late afternoon, your boots are slightly more pliable. Your coat feels less wet. Nothing is fully dry, but it is better. Better is what you aim for here. You do not wait for perfect conditions because perfect does not come. You work with what you have, and you prepare for the next night. As the sun lowers again, you gather your clothing like armor, checking each item with your hands, feeling for dampness, stiffness, weakness. You're not just dressing. You're building a barrier between your body and a night that wants to pull heat out of you. You step back into the dugout and settle near the stove, letting the small warmth brush against your knees. The work of drying will continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Winter stretches long, but you have learned to manage it piece by piece, boot by boot, mitten by mitten, shirt by shirt. And when you finally lie down again, you do it with clothes that are not comfortable, not fresh, but just dry enough to let you sleep. You notice it in the small habits, the ones that feel older than this place. A way of tucking fabric just so. A method of sealing a draft with mud and straw. These choices did not come from manuals written for the plains. They travelled here inside people, carried across oceans and borders, resurfacing quietly underground. As winter tightens its grip, you begin to recognise how much borrowed knowledge lives in this dugout. Families arriving from Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and parts of Asia brought memories of cold that bit just as hard, even if the landscapes were different. In villages where winters dragged on for months, people had long learned how to live close to the earth. Cellars, half-buried houses, turf walls. These ideas slipped into prairie life almost without announcement. You smooth a section of wall where straw has been mixed into the dirt. It helps prevent cracking as the soil dries and shrinks. This is not something you invented here. It echoes older building traditions, ones used in places where wood was scarce and cold was constant. Settlement records show that immigrant communities were often quicker to adopt dugouts and sod structures, not because they lacked ambition, but because the logic felt familiar. You think about how knowledge moves when it has no official name. It passes through observation, through watching elders work, through remembering how something was done back home. A grandmother shows a child how to seal a gap. A neighbour demonstrates how to bank earth against a wall before the first freeze. No one calls it expertise. It is simply how things are done. One quietly persistent practice appears again and again in winter recollections. People slept with their heads lower than their feet, believing warmer air settled upward, and that this position helped retain heat. Whether the physics truly supported it mattered less than the fact that many believed it worked. Belief shapes behaviour, and behaviour shapes survival. You also notice how food storage habits change underground. Root vegetables are tucked into cool corners. Fermented foods are kept near the walls where temperature stays steady. These methods mirror practices from older homelands adapted to new materials. The dugout becomes not just shelter, but a pantry, a cellar, a living archive of remembered winters. Some modern researchers suggest that immigrant groups endured prairie winters with slightly lower mortality in certain regions, possibly due to these carried skills. Others caution that records are uneven and influenced by many factors including settlement patterns and resources. Sitting here, the debate feels distant. What matters is that these techniques worked often enough to be repeated. You recall seeing how someone lined a sleeping area with woven mats beneath blankets. The mats were not thick, but they broke contact with the cold floor. Similar mats had been used for centuries in other cold regions, made from reeds, grasses, or straw. Here, prairie grass fills that role. The material changes, the idea remains. The dugout itself starts to feel like a meeting place of histories. This is not just American frontier ingenuity, it is a blending. Old world solutions meeting new world conditions adjusted through trial and error. People did not abandon what they knew, they reshaped it. You feel that reshaping in your own routines now, the way you prepare for night, the way you respect the earth wall rather than fighting it, the way you listen for subtle changes instead of dramatic ones. These habits feel ancient even if you only learned them recently. There are moments of tension too. Some settlers resisted underground living, seeing it as a step backward, a reminder of poverty they hoped to escape. Others embraced it, finding comfort in familiarity. These differences sometimes divided communities, shaping who helped whom and whose advice was trusted. Cold sharpened these lines, but it also blurred them when survival demanded cooperation. You lie back and study the ceiling, tracing cracks that look almost intentional. Straw fibres peek through in places holding soil together. The roof smells faintly of grass and smoke. It feels solid, not permanent but dependable enough. That word keeps returning. Dependable. Many of the techniques borrowed from elsewhere shared that quality. They were not elegant, they endured. Outside, the wind rises again, sliding over snow hardened by days of cold. You hear it, but do not feel it. Underground, the world arrives, filtered and softened. This too is an old idea. Shelter as separation. Distance as protection. You think about how history often celebrates innovation while overlooking adaptation. Yet here adaptation is everything. The dugout survives because it listens to climate, to soil, to memory. It holds not just bodies but accumulated experience compressed into routines repeated nightly. As you settle into sleep, you realize you're not just enduring a Wild West winter. You're participating in a much longer story of humans learning to share space with cold. The prairie did not invent these solutions. It demanded them. People answered with whatever knowledge they carried and whatever the land allowed. The dugout grows quiet again. Breathing slows. Heat settles where it can. Above you, snow and soil layer together, creating a barrier built as much from history as from earth. And in that layered space you rest, supported by generations you've never met, whose lessons found their way here through hands and habits rather than words. You start counting fuel long before it actually runs out. Winter teaches this habit early. Every piece of wood, every lump of coal, every twisted scrap that might burn, becomes something you notice, evaluate, and quietly measure against the nights ahead. Firewood myths fade quickly out here. The idea that the plains would somehow provide enough fuel on their own turns out to be just that, an idea. You step outside briefly and look across the land. Snow lies thin in some places, scoured away by wind piled high in others. There are still no trees. That fact settles in deeper with each passing week. When people first arrived, some believed they would discover hidden groves, or that trees would grow once the land was claimed and worked. Winter corrects that optimism fast. The prairie is honest about what it offers and what it withholds. Inside the dugout, fuel is stacked carefully, not because there is much of it, but because order makes scarcity feel manageable. You keep the driest pieces closest to the stove. Anything questionable stays farther back, saved for desperation. People learn to categorize fuel by burn quality without naming it. Fast burning for quick warmth, Slow smouldering for long nights, nothing is wasted. You remember hearing that dried animal dung burns well. At first the idea feels strange, even unpleasant, but after a few nights of watching the fire die too early, practicality wins. On the plains, dung was abundant, dried naturally by sun and wind, and surprisingly effective as fuel. It burns hot and steady, producing little flame but dependable heat. You learn to collect it without much thought, another task folded into daily routine. The smell is different when it burns earthy and sharp, but not unbearable. In fact, after a while it becomes associated with warmth itself. Winter has a way of reshaping preferences. What once seemed unthinkable becomes normal once it proves useful. You ration fire carefully. The stove is rarely allowed to roar. A roaring fire eats fuel greedily and leaves you colder later. Instead, you aim for consistency. A low, steady burn that stretches what you have. Nights are planned around this rhythm. You bank the fire before sleeping, adjusting airflow so it will last as long as possible. People wrote often about the anxiety of fuel running low. Not panic exactly, but a persistent awareness that never quite faded. Every cold snap made calculations sharper. How many nights could this pile last? How much warmth could be spared during the day? These questions followed people even into sleep. You learn to use daylight as a heat source when possible. On clearer days, you open the dugout entrance and let sunlight spill in, warming walls and floors slightly before sealing it again. This borrowed warmth carries into evenings, small but noticeable. The earth absorbs it willingly, releasing it back after dark. There were times when fuel simply ran out. On those nights, people layered everything they owned and relied entirely on insulation and shared warmth. These nights were remembered vividly not because they were dramatic, but because they required absolute stillness. Movement wasted heat. Talking did too. Everyone learned to lie quietly and wait for morning. You handle each remaining piece of fuel now with care, aware that it represents time. Not just heat, but hours of survivable cold. You break larger pieces smaller to control burn rate. You save crumbs and splinters. Nothing that can smoulder is discarded. The dugout holds its temperature stubbornly, but it cannot create warmth on its own. Fuel is the difference between endurance and misery. You feel that truth in your bones as you feed the stove again, listening to it catch, then settle. Outside, the prairie offers no help. Inside, the fire answers imperfect but loyal as long as you respect its limits. You sit close for a while, letting the warmth soak into your knees and hands, then retreat to conserve it. As night approaches again, you take one last look at your fuel stack. It is smaller than you would like. It always is. But it is enough for now. Enough to get through tonight. Enough to let you sleep without fear of waking numb. You lie back and listen to the quiet crackle, counting time not in hours, but in how long the heat lingers. Winter survival here is not about abundance, it is about pacing. And tonight, paced carefully, the fire will last just long enough. You discover that sleep itself becomes a technique. Not rest exactly, but positioning. How you lie down matters more than you ever expected. In a place where warmth is limited, posture turns into strategy, and you learn it through trial rather than instruction. You ease yourself onto the bedding and curl instinctively, drawing knees toward chest arms tucked in close. This shape feels natural, almost animal. It reduces exposed surface, keeps heat near your core. People learned quickly that sprawling was a luxury for warmer climates. Here, compactness kept blood moving where it mattered most. Accounts from prairie settlements often mention people waking in the same curled position they fell asleep in, stiff but intact. Straightening out felt dangerous. Limbs left extended, cooled faster, numbed sooner. You adjust your legs slightly, tucking your feet beneath a fold of blanket, making sure toes are fully covered before anything else. Feet go first. They always do. You notice how heads are positioned lower than bodies, not out of comfort but intent. Warm air settles upward, and even in a dugout, that subtle difference matters. Some people slept with their shoulders slightly elevated, others with their heads nearly level with the floor. Over time, everyone developed a preference shaped by nights that went wrong. There is a quiet ritual to arranging sleep. Blankets are smoothed, not shaken. Shaking releases trapped warmth. Movements are slow, deliberate. Once settled, you avoid shifting unless absolutely necessary. Stillness becomes a form of insulation. You recall being told not to sleep too deeply. It sounds counterintuitive, but there is truth in it. Deep sleep dulls awareness. On bitter nights, people needed to wake occasionally to adjust coverings, check circulation, or respond if the fire faltered. Sleep came in layers light and fragmented, woven through with awareness. You place an arm across your chest and feel your heartbeat steady. That rhythm becomes something you pay attention to. Slow and even is good. Shivering is not. When shivering starts, you know warmth is being lost faster than it can be replaced. You respond before it escalates, tightening blankets, shifting closer to others if possible. Children were often taught specific sleeping positions early, not as discipline but as protection. Elders corrected them, gently pulling limbs and tucking chins down. These lessons were passed, silently reinforced every cold morning when someone woke warm enough to move. There are nights when people slept sitting up, backs against walls, knees drawn high, sharing blankets between them. This position reduced contact with the floor and kept air pockets warm. It was not comfortable, but it worked when dampness crept in, or when space was limited. You feel the dugout floor beneath you firm and unyielding. Even with layers, it pulls heat steadily. You adjust a rolled blanket beneath your hips, lifting yourself just enough to break contact. This small change makes a difference you can feel almost immediately. Breathing slows as your body settles into conservation mode. You breathe through your nose if you can, warming air before it reaches your lungs. Mouth breathing brings cold deeper faster. You learn this quickly after one rough night. You think about how these sleeping habits would look to someone watching from the outside. Curled forms, layered fabric, barely moving for hours. It might look uncomfortable, even bleak. From inside the experience, it feels purposeful. Every choice has a reason. As the night deepens, you drift in and out of shallow sleep, waking just enough to check toes, fingers the position of your chin. Each time everything feels acceptable, not warm, but safe. The cold presses from the walls, patient as ever, but it does not break through. Your body holds its shape, conserving what heat it can. You realize that survival here is not about defeating winter in grand gestures. It is about dozens of small decisions repeated every night. You remain curled, breathing slow, listening to the quiet pulse of the dugout. Sleep comes gently, never fully, but enough. And when it does, it holds you in the shape that keeps you alive until morning finds you again. You begin to notice how the cold creeps beyond skin and bone, settling into thoughts as much as muscles. Winter illness does not always arrive with drama. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as fatigue, a lingering cough, a stiffness that does not ease with movement. In a dugout, these small changes feel heavier, more personal, because there is nowhere to escape them. You listen more closely now. A rasp in someone's breathing. A cough that repeats too often. Nights stretch longer when sickness enters the space. People feared fever in winter not only because of the illness itself, but because weakness made it harder to stay warm. Heat had to be earned here through movement, alertness, and shared effort. Illness stole all three. Remedies were simple and often improvised. Warm drinks when possible. Extra blankets redistributed without argument. Someone sick slept closest to the stove or between the strongest bodies. Care was practical before it was tender. Comfort followed function. You remember how people spoke of drafts as if they were living things. Cold air was blamed for aches, chills, and sickness, and doors were sealed obsessively. Whether drafts truly caused illness mattered less than the belief that they did. Belief shaped behavior, and behavior shaped outcomes. The dugout became tighter, more enclosed as winter wore on. Superstition found room to grow in long nights. A certain cough meant bad luck. A sudden chill signaled trouble ahead. Some people hung small charms or symbols near the entrance, not expecting miracles, but hoping for reassurance. When the world felt unpredictable, small rituals offered a sense of control. You feel the tension that sickness brings. The balance shifts. Resources stretch thinner. Fire must be kept steadier. Sleep becomes lighter. Even the quiet feels different, charged with concern. People watched each other closely, not out of fear, but necessity. There were moments when illness passed quickly, leaving behind relief and gratitude. Other times it lingered, testing patience and endurance. Winter magnified everything. A mild sickness in summer became a serious obstacle when warmth required constant effort. You think about how little medicine was available. Help often arrived too late or not at all. People relied on observation routine and hope. They learned to read signs in skin color, breathing, and alertness. Care was intimate and constant. The dugout holds this vulnerability without judgment. It shelters the sick and the well together, forcing cooperation. You adjust blankets again, making room-sharing warmth, understanding that today it is them, tomorrow it could be you. As the night settles, breathing evens out. The cough softens, or maybe it does not. Either way, you stay still, conserving energy, listening. Winter illness teaches patience, not because patience cures, but because rushing helps nothing. You close your eyes, aware of the fragile balance holding everyone through the night. The cold waits, the body resists, and the dugout stands quietly between them. Sleep comes slowly, carefully carrying you just far enough away to rest, but close enough to wake if needed. You feel it most in the pauses. The long stretches between tasks, between voices, between one day and the next. Cold stretches time in strange ways, and loneliness slips into those stretched spaces quietly. In a dugout, isolation does not mean being alone. It means feeling cut off from anything beyond these walls of earth. The prairie outside is vast, but in winter it might as well be another planet. Travel slows to a crawl. Snow and cold turn short distances into real obstacles. You cannot simply visit a neighbour or ride into town without weighing the risk, so you stay. Days pass with only the same few faces, the same routines, the same dim interior. The dugout becomes your whole world. You notice how silence changes when it lasts too long. At first it is restful, then it becomes heavy. You start listening for sounds that are not there. Footsteps, voices, anything to break the sameness. People often talked more in winter, not because they had more to say, but because speech reminded them they were still connected to others. You sit close to the wall and trace patterns in the dirt absent-mindedly. Small marks half erased, left by someone else weeks ago. Evidence that time is moving even if it feels stalled. These tiny signs matter. They anchor you. Letters from frontier winters often describe longing more than fear. Longing for familiar places, familiar people, familiar noise. The cold stripped away distraction. There was little to do but think, and thinking could spiral if left unchecked. You learn to manage your mind the way you manage the fire. Feed it just enough. Do not let it run wild or burn out completely. You find comfort in routine. Morning checks, midday tasks, evening preparation, night watchfulness. Repetition becomes structure, and structure pushes loneliness back into the corners. Even chores you once resented now feel grounding. They prove you're still part of something, even if that something is small. There are moments when the dugout feels like protection and prison at the same time. It keeps the cold out, but it also keeps the world away. You sit and imagine the horizon beyond the snow flat and endless, unchanged by your absence. That thought can feel freeing or crushing depending on the hour. People learn to mark time creatively. A candle burned at the same hour each night, a scratch on the wall for each passing day, small celebrations when storms ended or supplies arrived. These gestures mattered. They broke the monotony and reminded everyone that winter, however long, was not permanent. You notice how physical closeness sometimes deepens emotional distance. When space is limited, irritation has nowhere to go. Small habits grate. Sounds feel louder. Breathing feels closer. People learn to forgive quickly or retreat inward. Both were forms of survival. You lie back and stare into the darkness, letting your thoughts drift without pushing them. Loneliness here is not dramatic. It is quiet, persistent, like the cold itself. It does not demand attention. It waits for it. Sleep becomes a refuge not just from discomfort, but from isolation. Dreams carry you elsewhere to warmer places or louder ones. Waking pulls you back gently but firmly into the present. You adjust, breathe, and accept where you are again. The dugout holds all of this without comment. It shelters not only bodies but moods, doubts, memories. Winter presses inward from every side and people press back by staying connected in whatever ways they can. As night deepens, someone hums softly. Another person responds without thinking, adding a second voice. The sound is low, almost swallowed by the earth, but it is enough. For a few moments the dugout feels less small. The cold feels less personal. You close your eyes, letting that sound fade naturally. Loneliness does not disappear, but it loosens its grip. Tomorrow will come slow and pale, and with it another set of tasks, another cycle to follow. That is how people endured. Not by conquering isolation, but by living alongside it until winter finally let go. Night sounds change underground. You learn this slowly by lying still and letting your ears adjust. The dugout filters noise in uneven ways. Some things vanish completely. Others arrive distorted, stretched, or amplified in ways that make them hard to place. The earth does not silence the world, it edits it. You hear the wind first, but not as a roar. It becomes a low pressure, a steady push that vibrates through walls and roof. It sounds closer than it should, as if the air itself is leaning against your shelter. Gusts come and go, each one producing a soft groan from packed soil and wood. These sounds are not warnings exactly. They are reminders that the surface world is restless. Then there are the animals. Not the ones you know and rely on, but the unseen ones that move after dark. Mice scratch faintly at the walls, their claws making quick, nervous patterns. You hear them pause, then continue, curious but cautious. They smell food. They smell warmth. Dugouts attract life, and not all of it is welcome. Larger sounds arrive more slowly. A fox cries somewhere in the distance, the sound warped as it passes through snow and earth. It no longer sounds like an animal. It sounds almost human, a thin wail that makes you sit up despite yourself. People wrote often about these cries, how unsettling they felt in winter, when imagination had too much room to wander. You remind yourself what it is. Knowledge helps, but it does not erase instinct. The night feels alive in ways daylight never does. Underground, you experience it through vibrations rather than sight. A thud outside might be a drifting branch, or it might be something brushing against the wall. You wait listening for a second sound that will tell you which. The dugout itself contributes its own voice. As temperatures drop, materials contract. A soft crack here, a dull pop there. Each sound has its own character, and over time you learn which ones matter. A sharp snap means wood shifting. A deeper rumble means soil settling. Panic fades as familiarity grows. There are moments when something heavier moves nearby. You feel it more than hear it, a slow pressure travelling through the ground. A deer passing close, a cow shifting weight. Once in a while, something unknown. These moments raise your pulse briefly, then pass. Animals, like people, seek shelter and paths of least resistance in winter. You keep a lantern close, not lit, but ready. Light changes how sound feels. Darkness sharpens it. In the absence of sight, your hearing fills the space completely. Every rustle carries weight. You learn to breathe quietly to avoid adding unnecessary noise that might mask something important. People often mistook ordinary sounds for danger during their first winters. Fear sharpened senses too much. Over time, the mind learned to sort signal from background. True threats announced themselves differently. A roof sagging sounded wrong. A sudden rush of snow carried urgency. Most other noises were simply the land adjusting. There is a strange comfort in this soundscape once you know it. Silence above ground can feel empty. Down here the layered noises feel like company. The dugout hums softly, never entirely quiet, never loud enough to demand attention. You lie back and let the sounds wash over you without chasing them. Wind, scratching, the slow settling of earth, someone breathing nearby. These become the rhythm of night. They mark time more reliably than clocks ever could. Eventually your mind stops cataloguing and starts drifting. Sounds blend together, losing their edges. The fox cry becomes wind. The scratching becomes rain. Your body relaxes into the familiar mix. Outside, the prairie continues its unseen movement. Inside, you remain held by earth and shadow, listening without alarm. The night has a voice here, and you have learned how to hear it without fear. Sleep comes softly carried on low sounds and steady breaths, and for a few hours at least the world above can do whatever it likes. Underground, you're listening, resting, and still very much alive. You sense the danger before you see it. A change in pressure. A sound that does not belong to wind or animal or settling soil. It is heavier than that, slower, like something giving way under its own weight. Dugouts were strong in their own quiet way, but they depended on balance. When that balance failed, the earth did not hesitate. You look up at the ceiling and notice a thin line where yesterday there was none. It is small, almost delicate, but it draws your attention immediately. Moisture has worked its way in again, softening soil that froze hard only days ago. Snow above melts just enough to weaken support. Then it freezes again. This cycle wears at the roof patiently. People learn to read these signs early because ignoring them carried consequences. A sag where there should be none. A slow rain of dust after a thaw. The sound of soil shifting, not settling. These moments turned ordinary nights into tense ones. You do not panic. Panic wastes time. Instead, you act carefully. You reach for a support post and test it with your hand. It feels solid, but you know that feeling can lie. Many dugouts used whatever wood was available for roof supports. Sometimes green, sometimes split, sometimes already weakened. The earth above does most of the work. The posts only guide it. When water and weight team up, guidance is not always enough. You move bedding away from the centre of the room, choosing the edges where walls are thickest. This is instinct now. If something falls, it usually falls from the middle. People who lived underground learned where to sit, where to sleep, where not to linger when weather shifted. There are stories of roofs collapsing suddenly without warning. There are also stories of slow failures where dirt trickled down for hours before anything serious happened. Which one you get depends on soil type, moisture construction, and luck. Living here means accepting that luck plays a role whether you like it or not. You listen closely. The dugout creaks again, deeper this time, not sharp, not sudden, just a low complaint. You wedge an extra board under the support, bracing it against the wall. It is not elegant, but it spreads the load. Many repairs here are like that. Temporary solutions meant to buy time. Dust falls lightly onto your sleeve. You brush it away and feel your heart rate rise, then settle again. Fear spikes quickly underground, but experience teaches you to ride it rather than fight it. You have done what you can for now. People sometimes slept fully dressed on nights like this, boots on lantern within reach. If the roof failed, escape had to be immediate. Dugouts usually had only one entrance. When it was blocked, digging became the only option. That knowledge never left your mind entirely. You imagine the weight above you, layers of snow soil, sod all pressing downward. It sounds terrifying when you think about it too long, so you do not. You focus instead on what is stable, the walls, the floor, the support you just placed. Time passes slowly. The crack does not widen. The dust stops falling. Whatever shift occurred has finished, at least for now. The dugout holds again, not because it is perfect, but because it is flexible. Earth gives a little before it breaks, and that gives you time to respond. You remain alert for a while, listening, watching shadows for movement that should not be there. Eventually, exhaustion nudges you toward rest again. Living underground means accepting risk without letting it consume you. If you stayed awake every time the earth complained, you would never sleep at all. You lie back near the wall, keeping your head turned toward the ceiling. Breathing slows. The dugout settles into stillness again as if nothing happened. In the morning you will shore things up properly if you can. Add more sod, divert water, reinforce weak spots. For now the danger has passed. The roof did not give way. The night continues. You close your eyes, trusting the earth just enough to let go. The cold waits patiently outside and gravity never sleeps. But inside this small space you have learned how to listen, how to respond and how to rest, even when the ground itself reminds you that nothing here is permanent. You feel it shift before anyone says a word. A sense of movement beyond your own space. Winter pushes people inward, but it also pushes them together. No one survives out here entirely alone for long, not without paying a price that grows heavier each season. A knock sounds at the entrance, muted by snow and earth. It is careful, deliberate. You recognize it immediately. Neighbors do not arrive unannounced in winter unless they have a reason. You move to open the door, bracing against the cold that spills in as it swings wide. Another family stands there, faces red, breath steaming. Their fire went out during the night. Their roof took on water. They need warmth, and they need it now. There is no discussion. The dugout is already crowded, but bodies can always make room for more bodies. You rearrange the space quickly, shifting bedding, pulling blankets from piles, stacking supplies tighter against the wall. Heat changes shape as more people enter. The air grows warmer, heavier, filled with breath and movement. What was barely enough before now has to stretch further. Winter cooperation has its own rules. No one keeps score. Help given now will be repaid later, maybe not in equal measure, maybe not at all. Survival depends on trust built quietly over time. Tonight that trust shows itself in shared space and shared warmth. Children are tucked into the safest spots first. Elders settle closest to the stove. Stronger adults take the edges closer to walls and drafts. These arrangements happen without argument, guided by habit rather than instruction. Conversation stays low. Energy is conserved. Someone stirs the fire. Someone checks the roof. Someone else pours out the last of a warm drink and passes it around. The dugout feels smaller but also steadier. Heat builds faster with more bodies present. You notice how relief softens faces almost immediately. The cold loosens its grip just enough for shoulders to drop, for breathing to slow. Being inside is not luxury. It is safety. There are nights when too many people gather, when air grows stale and tempers fray. Tonight holds together. Everyone understands what is at stake. Winter leaves little room for pride. You think about how often these quiet rescues happened without record. No headlines, no markers, just people opening doors and making space. The landscape looks empty from a distance, but it is threaded with these moments of connection. As the night deepens, the dugout hums with low sound. Breathing overlaps. Someone shifts and another adjusts blankets to follow. Heat circulates slowly, stubbornly. The fire burns low, but steady. Outside, the cold continues its work indifferent to cooperation. Inside, cooperation pushes back, not dramatically, but effectively. You remain awake longer than usual, watching, listening, making sure everyone settles. Eventually, sleep finds its way into the crowded space. It arrives in layers, light and uneven, but it arrives. Bodies relax into the shared warmth, and the dugout holds all of you without complaint. When morning comes, people will dig out their homes, relight fires, and return the favor when needed. For now the night is contained. The cold is held at the boundary. You lie back, surrounded by the quiet weight of community. In this place, warmth is not owned. It is borrowed and shared, passed hand to hand through the long winter nights. And tonight that is what keeps everyone alive. You become aware of how much of what you do now was learned indirectly. Not from books or instructions, but from watching others who knew the land before you arrived. The cold has a way of exposing gaps in knowledge, and the plains were already full of people who understood winter in ways newcomers did not. You remember noticing how certain shelters nearby were positioned, differently angled just enough to avoid the worst of the wind, entrances tucked away from open exposure, earth banked higher on one side than the other. These choices were not random. They came from long familiarity with weather patterns, from watching storms move and learning where cold liked to linger. Some of the practices you use now were borrowed quietly. Snow piled intentionally against walls instead of cleared away. Fire kept low rather than blazing. Movement slowed to conserve energy. These ideas did not announce themselves as lessons. They were observed, absorbed, and adapted, often without acknowledging where they came from. You think about how people here use the land itself as insulation. Earth, grass, snow, even ash became building materials. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose tied to survival rather than comfort. That way of thinking feels different from the one you arrived with, but it makes sense now. You recall seeing how food was stored outside in winter, buried under snow, or packed into shaded pits where temperature stayed even. Meat frozen solid but protected from scavengers. Roots kept cool without spoiling. These methods relied on understanding cold not as an enemy to defeat but as a condition to work with. There were moments of misunderstanding too. Techniques that worked in one climate failed here. Methods borrowed without full context led to mistakes. But winter corrected those mistakes quickly. What worked stayed. What did not was abandoned. You adjust the entrance covering again, mimicking something you once saw done differently than you expected. It holds better against the wind. That small success reinforces the lesson. Knowledge does not always arrive labelled. Sometimes it arrives disguised as common sense after the fact. The dugout itself reflects this blending. It is not purely one tradition or another. It is shaped by environment first, then by people learning from each other. Cold strips away pretense. Only results matter. You settle back and listen to the familiar sounds of night. The earth holds steady. The fire breathes quietly. Outside, the wind slides past without finding a way in. You feel gratitude, not abstract, but practical. Winter has taught you to pay attention, to observe before acting, to respect methods that existed long before you needed them. Survival here is not about invention. It is about listening. You close your eyes, letting the dugout do its work. The cold remains, but it is no longer mysterious. It has patterns, and you are learning how to live within them. You start to notice that not all winters feel the same, even when the cold bites just as hard. The land changes character from place to place, and with it the way a dugout behaves through the night. What works perfectly here might fail 100 miles away. People learned this only by living through it. In some areas the ground freezes deep and stays that way for months. Dugouts there feel firm and dependable, walls locked, solid moisture slowed to a crawl. Cold still presses in, but it does so evenly, predictably. In other regions, the soil freezes and thaws in cycles, expanding and shrinking just enough to keep everyone on edge. Cracks appear, vanish, then return somewhere new. You learn to read the land beneath you as much as the weather above. Wind plays a different game depending on where you are. On open plains, it scours relentlessly, stripping snow away and exposing the ground to deeper cold. Dugouts there rely more on earth thickness than snow cover. In gentler terrain, snow piles up and stays wrapping shelters in a muffling layer that softens temperature swings. People noticed that two dugouts built the same way could feel entirely different, simply because of where they sat. You think about settlers who moved west in stages, building new dugouts as they went. Each winter taught them something different. What felt excessive in one place proved insufficient in another. Over time, designs shifted subtly. Roofs grew thicker, entrances turned slightly. Drainage channels became deeper or shallower depending on local conditions. You adjust your own space with this awareness now. The way the wind hits the entrance, how snow drifts form nearby. where water tends to collect after a brief thaw. These details matter more than general rules. Winter rewards attention to specifics. You remember hearing about places where dugouts stayed surprisingly mild even during severe cold spells. In other areas, the same temperatures felt brutal. Soil composition played a role. So did elevation proximity to water and exposure. Living underground was never a universal solution, it was a flexible one. The nights reflect these differences too. Some dugouts held warmth long after fires died. Others chilled quickly once heat faded. People adapted their routines accordingly, banking fires earlier or later, layering more or less sleeping closer together or farther apart. You lie back and consider how much of this knowledge never made it into official records. It lived in habits, in small adjustments passed between neighbours. Winter was the teacher, and it graded harshly. As the night settles, your dugout behaves the way you expect it to. The walls hold. The cold presses, but not aggressively. You feel a quiet confidence that comes from knowing this particular place, not just the idea of it. Somewhere else on the plains, someone else lies awake in a dugout that feels entirely different, listening to different sounds, managing different risks. The shared experience is winter. The details are local. You close your eyes, aware that survival here is not one story, but many overlapping ones shaped by land and weather together. Tonight in this place you rest, knowing how your ground behaves, and that knowledge earned slowly is what lets you sleep at all. You begin to sense the difference between adapting and simply enduring. At first, winter feels like something to be survived day by day, night by night, with teeth clenched and muscles tight. Over time, something shifts. The routines settle. The fear dulls. You stop reacting and start anticipating. That is the line between suffering and learning. You no longer wait for cold to surprise you. You prepare for it hours in advance. Fires are banked earlier, bedding is arranged before exhaustion sets in. Food is eaten with an eye toward the night ahead, rather than the hunger of the moment. These choices do not make winter easy, but they make it predictable. Predictability is its own form of comfort. Some people never reach this point. They grit their way through each night as if it were the first, never fully trusting the dugout or their own ability to manage it. Others settle in adjusting their expectations rather than fighting them. You feel yourself leaning toward the second path now. The cold still matters, but it no longer dominates every thought. You notice how your body responds differently than it did weeks ago. Shivering comes later, if at all. Fingers stiffen more slowly. Breathing feels less urgent. These changes are subtle, easy to miss, but they accumulate. The body learns what the mind accepts. Winter does not defeat you outright. It reshapes you. There is a quiet pride in this adjustment, though you would never name it that way out loud. It shows up instead as confidence in small decisions. Knowing when to add a layer, knowing when not to. Understanding how long the fire will last without checking. These instincts feel earned. You think about how some settlers spoke later of these winters with a strange calm, even affection. Not because they were pleasant, but because they were formative. The dugout nights stripped life down to essentials. Warmth, shelter, people. Everything else faded into background noise. You sit near the wall and let your hand rest against the earth, feeling its steady cool. You're no longer offended by it. The ground is doing exactly what it always does. It is you who had to learn how to live alongside it. There are still hard nights. Nights when the cold pushes deeper than expected. Nights when sleep refuses to come. Adaptation does not erase difficulty. It changes your relationship to it. Instead of asking how to escape winter, you ask how to move through it. You lie back and listen to the familiar sounds of the dugout. Nothing new, nothing alarming. That in itself feels like progress. Stability was once something you hoped for. Now it is something you expect. As sleep approaches, you realize that endurance alone would have worn you down by now. What keeps you here is not toughness, but adjustment. The willingness to let go of old ideas about comfort and replace them with something quieter and more reliable. The night passes in steady rhythm. breathing, fire, earth. You drift without resistance, held not by warmth exactly, but by understanding. Winter continues outside, unmoved by your growth. But inside the dugout, something has changed. You're no longer just surviving the cold. You're living within it. And that makes all the difference. You notice the change before it fully arrives. It begins as a rumour carried by travellers and letters, then becomes something you can almost feel in the air. The world beyond the dugout is shifting slowly, unevenly, but enough to matter. Supplies start to appear that once felt unimaginable, nails that are not bent and reused, boards cut to consistent sizes, fuel that burns longer and cleaner. The railroad does not arrive all at once. It creeps closer in sections mile by mile, bringing with it the promise of materials that do not depend on what the land happens to offer. For people living in dugouts, this changes the calculation of winter survival. Not immediately and not completely, but enough to be noticed. You unwrap a small package and feel the difference in your hands. Manufactured goods carry a certain predictability. A stove part that fits as expected. A blanket woven tightly and evenly. These things do not replace the dugout, but they make it easier to manage. Nights feel less fragile when fewer parts are improvised. You think about how this shift affects behaviour. Fires burn more steadily. Repairs last longer. Roofs hold better under snow. The dugout remains essential, but it no longer feels like the only option. That knowledge alone lightens the mind even when conditions stay harsh. You also sense a hesitation. Change brings uncertainty of its own. New materials behave differently. Wood dries and cracks in unfamiliar ways. Coal burns hotter than expected. People learn again through trial adjusting routines that once felt settled. Some begin adding above-ground rooms, not to abandon the dugout, but to expand possibilities. A place to work during daylight, a spot to dry clothes more effectively. Winter living becomes layered, moving up and down depending on temperature and task. You remain underground tonight because the cold still demands it, but the space feels less temporary than it once did. Improvements accumulate quietly. A tighter seal here, a sturdier support there, none of it dramatic, all of it meaningful. You lie back and think about how progress does not erase hardship. It shifts it. Winter still comes. Cold still bites. But survival requires fewer compromises than before. The dugout hums softly around you, holding warmth and memory together. Tomorrow may bring new materials, new choices. Tonight you rest, knowing that change is possible even if it arrives slowly. You notice how stories begin to change once the worst nights are behind you. At first, winter was spoken about in short phrases and tired glances, as if naming it too fully might bring it back stronger. Now, as days stretch a little longer and the cold loosens its grip, memories start to settle into something else. People talk while hands are busy, while mending, while preparing for the next season. The dugout comes up in conversation more often than you expect. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of careful respect. Someone laughs quietly about a night when the fire nearly died. Someone else remembers waking to snow at eye level. These moments are shared without drama, as if they belong to a different version of everyone present. You realize that memory smooths edges faster than experience. Nights that felt endless now compress into anecdotes. Fear becomes tension. Discomfort becomes inconvenience. Even the cold itself seems less sharp when recalled from the safety of daylight. This doesn't mean people forget how hard it was. It means they survived it, and survival changes perspective. You sit inside the dugout and look around with new eyes. The walls bear marks of the season, soot stains, scratches, reinforcements added in haste. Each mark is a record, even if no one writes it down. This space held you when the world above was hostile. That counts for something. You hear someone say they will almost miss it. The statement hangs in the air, surprising even the person who said it. Miss the dugout. Miss the closeness. Miss the simplicity forced by winter. No one argues, but no one fully agrees either. Feelings are mixed, complicated by relief and fatigue. You think about how humans remember hardship selectively. We carry forward what taught us something and let the rest fade. The dugout nights taught patience, they taught cooperation, they taught attention. Those lessons remain even when the cold retreats. You touch the wall again, not to check for damp or cracks this time, but out of familiarity. The earth feels the same as it always did. Cool, solid, unconcerned. It does not care how you remember it. That work belongs to you. As evening comes, the dugout feels different. Not warmer, but lighter. The air does not press as hard. The silence feels less absolute. You realize that you are already beginning to leave this season behind, even while still inside it. You lie back and let sleep come without vigilance for once. The night passes quietly, and when morning arrives, it carries with it the understanding that some memories will stay longer than the cold ever did. You are surprised by the feeling when it arrives, subtle and almost embarrassing in its tenderness. The cold has eased enough that you can imagine life above ground again, and yet part of you hesitates. The dugout, once a last resort, has become familiar in ways you did not expect. You stand inside and take stock not out of necessity but reflection. The space is small, the ceiling still bears faint stains from smoke and moisture. The floor is worn smooth, where feet passed night after night. None of it would impress anyone from the outside, still this place kept its promise. It did not ask for admiration, it simply held. You remember how resistant you were at first, how the idea of living underground felt temporary, almost shameful, something to endure until real housing arrived. Yet as weeks passed, the dugout stopped feeling like an emergency measure and started feeling like a rhythm. You learned its moods. You knew when it would feel warmer, when it would feel damp, when it needed attention. Some people choose to move out as soon as they can. Others linger longer than expected. They add small comforts. A shelf smoothed carefully. A hook placed just right. These are not the actions of people eager to leave. They are the actions of people who have grown attached, even if they would never admit it aloud. You understand now why some settlers later spoke of dugouts with an odd fondness. Not because the conditions were good, but because the relationship was honest. The earth gave shelter and asked only respect in return. No illusions, no promises of ease. You imagine future winters, warmer houses, thicker walls, more reliable heat. Those will be welcome. Yet something about the dugout will stay with you. The way it forced attention. The way it narrowed life down to what mattered. The way nights felt longer, but more present. You sit quietly, listening to the familiar hush. Outside, the land stretches wide again, no longer pressing so hard. Inside, the dugout feels almost gentle. It is not calling you to stay, but it is not pushing you out either. You breathe slowly, letting that feeling settle. Nostalgia arrives quickly when hardship ends. It wraps discomfort in meaning. You recognize it for what it is, and still you allow it space. When you finally rise, you do so without urgency. There is time now. Time to choose, time to move upward when you're ready. For tonight you remain here not because you must, but because you want one more night of the quiet it offers. The dugout does not respond. It does not need to. It has already done its work. You lie awake longer than necessary, not because of cold this time, but because the quiet invites reflection. The nights underground have taught you things that do not feel like lessons at first. They arrive later, when the body is no longer struggling just to stay warm and the mind has space to wander. Endurance here was never loud. It did not announce itself with heroic gestures or dramatic turning points. It showed up in restraint, in knowing when not to act, in waiting out discomfort rather than wasting energy fighting it. The cold rewarded patience more often than strength. You think about how your attention sharpened over the weeks. You learn to notice small changes in air sound and temperature, to respond early rather than late. That awareness did not come from instruction. It grew naturally shaped by nights when ignoring a detail meant real consequences. The dugout became a classroom without words. You remember how fear changed too. At first it was constant and undefined. Everything felt dangerous. Over time, fear became specific. You knew what mattered and what did not. A certain creak meant nothing. Another demanded action. That clarity made the nights easier to bear. The cold also taught humility. You could not overpower it. You could not reason with it. You adjusted instead. You bent routines around it. You accepted limits. That acceptance did not feel like surrender. It felt like understanding. You realize how much of modern life tries to erase discomfort entirely. Heat on demand, light at a switch, silence when desired. Here none of that existed. Comfort was earned slowly and held carefully. That effort made it meaningful in ways convenience rarely does. You think about how these lessons travelled forward. People who lived through such winters carried that patience into other parts of life. Crops failed, markets shifted, plans changed. They adapted because adaptation had already been required of them nightly. The dugout fades into shadow as your eyes grow heavy. It has become more than a shelter. It is a reminder of what humans can tolerate when they have to, and how they can find steadiness even in narrow, imperfect spaces. You breathe deeply, feeling the calm that comes from having nothing urgent left to manage. The fire is steady, the air is acceptable, the walls are quiet. That is enough. Sleep arrives gently, carrying with it the understanding that these cold nights shape something durable inside you. Not toughness for its own sake, but a quiet confidence that you can adjust, wait, and endure. The earth holds you one last time, steady and indifferent, and you let it. You return to the dugout as if it has been waiting for you, unchanged, patient, familiar in its quiet way. The season is easing now, but tonight you choose to come back underground one last time. Not out of necessity, out of recognition. This place carried you through something that demanded everything you had, and you feel the need to acknowledge that before moving on. You lower yourself down, knees bending automatically, body remembering the shape of the space. The air is cool, but no longer sharp. The walls feel steady beneath your fingertips. You notice details you once checked obsessively, and now simply accept. The entrance seal, the roof line, the floor worn smooth by months of careful movement. You lie back where you have slept so many nights and let the silence settle. It is different now, not heavy, not tense. It feels complete, like a chapter closing without being forced shut. The cold is still present, but it no longer presses. It has done what it came to do. You think about how the dugout never promised comfort. It offered something quieter. Consistency, protection, time. In return, it asked attention and respect. That exchange shaped every night you spent here. It shaped you too. Above ground, the land waits open and wide again. New shelters will rise, new routines will replace the old ones, but this place will remain in memory as the point where survival narrowed down to its essentials. You breathe slowly, letting your body sink into the familiar firmness beneath you. There is nothing left to adjust, nothing left to watch. For once you can rest without listening for danger. The earth holds you not tightly, not possessively, just enough. And as you drift, the night begins to soften into something gentler. The dugout fades from a shelter into a feeling one you will carry long after you leave. You are safe. You are warm enough. You are done. The night stretches out, now calm and unhurried. The cold that once demanded your attention has loosened its grip, retreating to the edges of thought. You no longer measure time by the fire or the weight of blankets. You let your breathing find its own rhythm, slow and steady. Outside, the world continues without asking anything of you. Inside, there is nothing left to manage. The earth beneath you feels solid and reassuring, a reminder that rest is allowed now. Muscles soften. Thoughts drift without effort. You let go of the vigilance that carried you through so many nights. There's no need to listen for creaks or shifting soil. No need to count fuel or check the door. Everything that needed doing has been done. As sleep deepens, images blur gently, earth and snow and quiet, blending into something abstract and soothing. The dugout becomes less a place and more a memory, warm around the edges, steady at the centre. You sink fully into rest, carried by the same patience that once kept you alive through the coldest nights. Nothing is required of you now. Just sleep. Sweet dreams.